There's a peculiar stillness that descends upon those who have glimpsed behind the curtain of ordinary existence, a kind of resonant silence that hums beneath all the noise of human activity. You've probably encountered such people. They sit at the edges of gatherings, not with the awkwardness of the shy or the bitterness of the excluded, but with a certain completeness, as if they've discovered something that makes the frantic pursuit of company seem somehow beside the point. And perhaps you've wondered what they know, or more precisely, what they've stopped believing that allows them to rest so easily in their own presence. The question of why spiritually awake people prefer solitude over company is not really a question about antisocial tendencies or misanthropy. It's far more interesting than that. It's a question about what happens to human consciousness when it stops operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. The misunderstanding that you are a separate, isolated entity that needs constant validation, stimulation, and reinforcement from the outside world to confirm that you exist, that you matter, that you're doing it right. When that illusion begins to crack, when you start to see through the elaborate game of personas and performances, something shifts in your relationship to both solitude and company. The preference for solitude doesn't arise from a rejection of others, but from a recognition that the boundary between self and other was never quite as solid as we'd been led to believe. Consider for a moment the desperation with which most people avoid being alone. We fill every silence with sound, every gap with activity, every moment of potential stillness with the buzzing static of distraction. We reach for our phones like addicts, scroll through the lives of strangers, cultivate elaborate digital personalities, and panic at the thought of a weekend without plans. This isn't simply a quirk of modern life, it's a symptom of something deeper, something that spiritually awake people have begun to see through. We avoid solitude because, in solitude, we might encounter the terrifying question that we've been running from since childhood. Who am I when no one is watching? What remains of me when I strip away all the roles, the performances, the carefully curated self-image that I present to the world? For most people, the answer to that question is too frightening to contemplate. Because what remains, when we're honest, seems like nothing, an absence, a void. And we've been taught since birth that voids are bad, that emptiness is something to be feared and filled, that silence is uncomfortable and needs to be broken. So we surround ourselves with people, with noise, with constant activity, building elaborate scaffolding around this sense of inner emptiness, hoping that if we accumulate enough external validation, enough experiences, enough relationships, we'll finally feel solid, real, substantial. But here's what spiritually awake people have discovered. That void isn't the problem, it's the solution. That emptiness isn't a deficit to be filled, but the very ground of being itself. The silence at the center of consciousness isn't an absence of something, but the presence of everything in its unmanifest potential. When you stop running from it and actually turn to face it, something extraordinary happens. The void reveals itself not as a terrifying nothingness, but as a vast, luminous spaciousness within which all experience arises and subsides like waves on an infinite ocean. This is what the mystics have been pointing at for millennia with their paradoxical language about emptiness and fullness, about dying to be reborn, about losing yourself to find yourself. They weren't speaking in riddles to be difficult. They were trying to articulate something that can't quite be captured in ordinary language, something that has to be experienced directly. And once you've had even a glimpse of it, your relationship to solitude transforms completely. Suddenly, being alone isn't lonely, it's luxurious. It's not isolation, it's intimacy with the deepest dimensions of your own being. The spiritually awake person has discovered that consciousness itself is inherently complete. It doesn't need to be fixed, improved, or validated by external circumstances. It's already whole, already perfect in its essential nature, like a mirror that reflects whatever appears but is never stained or altered by the reflections. When you know yourself as this aware presence, rather than as the stream of thoughts and emotions passing through it, the desperate need for constant company begins to fall away naturally, not through effort or discipline, but through simple recognition of what's true. This doesn't mean that such people become hermits who reject all human contact. That would be just another form of the same error, just flipping from one pole to the other. Rather, they discover a different way of being with people, one that doesn't come from need, but from overflow. They can enjoy company when it arises naturally, can engage fully and authentically with others, but they're not driven by a compulsive hunger for social interaction to fill an inner emptiness. The difference is subtle but profound. It's the difference between eating because you're genuinely hungry and eating to stuff down uncomfortable feelings. Both involve the same activity, but the quality, the motivation, the inner state is completely different. When you observe people at social gatherings, really observe them, you begin to see the intricate dance of mutual validation that's occurring. Watch how conversations flow, how people position themselves, how they angle for attention, how they compete for status, how they perform their personalities. It's not that any of this is wrong or bad. It's simply the natural behavior of the egoic self trying to confirm its existence through the attention and acknowledgement of others. We're all doing it, mostly unconsciously, because we've been taught that this is how you build a self, how you become somebody, how you matter in the world. The ego, you see, is fundamentally insecure. It has to be, because it's a construction, a useful fiction, a story we tell ourselves about who we are. And stories require an audience to be real. A story told to no one, heard by no one, acknowledged by no one. Does it even exist? The ego senses this profound uncertainty at its core, and so it constantly seeks confirmation, validation, proof that it's real, that it exists, that it matters. And the primary way it does this is through other people, through their attention, their approval, their recognition. This is why criticism stings so sharply, why rejection feels like a threat to our very existence, why we obsess over what others think of us. It's not just vanity or insecurity in the trivial sense. It's that the ego literally derives its sense of being from the reflections it receives from others. You are who others say you are, who you imagine they think you are. Your entire sense of self is built from these reflected appraisals, these mirrored images, these social constructions. And this means you can never rest, never relax, because the ego's existence depends on constant maintenance, constant performance, constant vigilance. Now imagine what happens when you begin to wake up from this trance, when you start to see through the mechanism of ego construction. It's like watching a magic trick for the second time, after you've learned how it's done. The illusion still occurs, but you're no longer fooled by it. You can see the wires, the mirrors, the sleight of hand. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The social game continues all around you. People are still performing their roles, still seeking validation, still building and defending their identities. But you're no longer as invested in playing. It's not that you're above it or better than others. It's simply that you've recognized it for what it is. A game, a dance, an elaborate collective fiction that we all agree to pretend is reality. This recognition can be unsettling at first. There's often a period of disorientation, of feeling alien in your own culture, of not quite knowing how to participate in conversations that seem to be about nothing, of wondering if something is wrong with you because you're no longer motivated by the things that motivate everyone else. You might find yourself at parties feeling like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, observing the rituals of social interaction with fascination, but without the urgent need to participate. This can feel lonely in a new way, not the loneliness of being excluded, but the loneliness of seeing what others don't see, of knowing something that can't easily be communicated. But if you stay with this process, if you don't flee back into the comfortable unconsciousness of social convention, something remarkable begins to happen. The initial disorientation gives way to a deeper ease, a profound relaxation. You realize that you don't have to maintain the exhausting performance anymore. You can let the whole constructed self rest, can stop trying so hard to be somebody, to prove something, to achieve a particular image in others' eyes. And in the space that opens up when you stop this compulsive self-construction, you discover something that was there all along, but obscured by all the noise. A simple, luminous awareness that requires nothing, lacks nothing, and is disturbed by nothing. This is what the Zen masters call your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. It's not some mystical entity or supernatural essence. It's simply the awareness that's reading these words right now, the consciousness within which all experience appears. It's so obvious that we miss it, so close that we look right past it, so fundamental that we take it for granted. We're so busy being somebody, constructing and maintaining our identity, our story, our persona, that we overlook the aware presence that's doing all of this, the witness that watches the entire show. And here's the beautiful irony. This aware presence is never actually alone. It can't be lonely because it's not separate from anything. The sense of being a separate self, cut off and isolated from the rest of existence, is itself a thought arising within this awareness. When that thought is believed, when we identify with it, we feel isolated, separate, in need of connection. But when we rest as the awareness itself, rather than as the thoughts and feelings passing through it, we discover that we're already intimately connected with everything. The separation was only ever conceptual, a way of thinking about experience rather than something fundamentally true about reality. This is why mystics throughout history have spoken of union, of oneness, of the dissolution of boundaries between self and other. They're not describing some special altered state that requires years of meditation to achieve. They're pointing to something that's always already the case, something that's obscured only by our habitual way of thinking and perceiving. When a spiritually awake person sits in solitude, they're not experiencing isolation. They're experiencing the intimacy of being with reality itself, without the filter of conceptual thought, without the barrier of the separate self-sense. Imagine you're a wave on the ocean, and you've somehow gotten the idea that you're fundamentally separate from all the other waves and from the ocean itself. You might feel isolated, competitive with other waves, anxious about your height and shape and duration. You might desperately seek out other waves to form relationships, to create an identity, to matter. But then one day you realize, I'm not just a wave, I'm the ocean expressing itself as a wave. Every wave is the ocean. The separation between waves is real on one level. You can point to distinct forms, distinct patterns, but on a deeper level, it's utterly illusory. The ocean is one continuous reality, and the waves are simply temporary forms it takes. This realization doesn't make you antisocial as a wave. You don't start hating other waves or refusing to interact with them. But your relationship to other waves changes fundamentally. You're no longer driven by desperate neediness, no longer trying to prove your waveness, no longer terrified of the dissolution that awaits all waves. You can enjoy the dance of waves meeting and mingling, can appreciate the unique beauty of each waveform, but you're not grasping at these interactions to fill some inner lack, because you know yourself as the ocean, and the ocean is never lacking, never incomplete. This is precisely what happens in spiritual awakening. The person discovers that the separate self they thought they were, this isolated entity bounded by skin, trapped in time, destined to die, is a fiction, a useful convention, but not ultimately true. What they actually are is the awareness in which this person appears, the consciousness that illuminates all experience. And this awareness isn't personal. It's not mine or yours. It's the single awareness that's looking out through all eyes, thinking through all minds, living through all lives. When you know yourself as this, the question of whether to be alone or with others becomes almost irrelevant. You're always alone in the sense that there's only one awareness, only one consciousness. And you're never alone in the sense that this consciousness is appearing as everything and everyone. People who haven't had this recognition often find such talk disturbing or incomprehensible. It sounds like nihilism, like a denial of the reality of individual persons, like some kind of metaphysical mumbo-jumbo that has no practical relevance. And from within the paradigm of the separate self, it is incomprehensible. How can I not be the person I experience myself to be? How can this vivid sense of being me, of being located here in this body, of having this particular history and personality, how can all of that be somehow unreal? But that's not quite what's being pointed at. The person is real, just not in the way we think. The personality exists. It's just not what we fundamentally are. It's more like a character in a play that consciousness is performing. The character is real within the context of the play, has real relationships, real experiences, real growth and development. But the actor playing the character knows that they're not fundamentally that character. They can get fully absorbed in the role, can cry real tears and feel real emotions, but there's also an awareness that knows it's playing a part. When you live from this recognition, your relationship to company becomes entirely natural and spontaneous. You're not avoiding people because you're wounded or afraid. You're not seeking people because you're needy or empty. You simply respond to the moment as it arises. If company presents itself and engagement feels natural, you engage fully, bringing your whole presence to the interaction. If solitude arises, you settle into it with the same ease, not counting the minutes until you can return to others. There's a fluidity, a flexibility, an absence of compulsion in either direction. This is actually very rare in human society. Most people are compulsively social, unable to be comfortable in their own company for any extended period. A smaller number are compulsively antisocial, uncomfortable in groups, and preferring isolation out of anxiety or misanthropy. But both of these patterns arise from the same root: the sense of being a separate, defended self that's either desperately seeking connection to fill its inner void or desperately protecting itself from the threat that others represent. The spiritually awake person has stepped out of both patterns by seeing through the separate self that generated them. This doesn't mean that awakened people are some sort of enlightened robots, moving through life without preferences or personality. That's a common misconception about spiritual awakening. The idea that it results in a kind of blank, emotionless, personalityless zombie state. Nothing could be further from the truth. Personality continues, preferences continue, emotions continue. What changes is the relationship to all of these. They're no longer taken to be what you fundamentally are. They're recognized as movements within consciousness, patterns of energy, and form that arise and subside, but they don't define or limit the awareness that witnesses them. So an awakened person might have a natural tendency toward introversion or extroversion based on their particular nervous system and conditioning. They might genuinely enjoy intellectual conversation or prefer silent companionship. They might love to dance and celebrate or find such activities exhausting. All of that individual variation continues, but it's held lightly, without the heavy identification that creates suffering. They're not clinging to their preferences or defending their personality. They're not trying to be a certain kind of person. There's a relaxation, a naturalness, a lack of self-consciousness about it all. What does change, universally, is the relationship to solitude. Because when you know yourself as consciousness rather than as the person, solitude is no longer experienced as isolation. You're never actually separate from the totality of existence, never cut off from the source of your being. In solitude, you're simply resting in your own nature without the distraction of social performance. And this resting is deeply nourishing, deeply restorative, in a way that's difficult to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. Think of it this way. Most people experience their minds as noisy, chaotic places, endless streams of thoughts, worries, plans, memories, fantasies, all jostling for attention. This mental noise is exhausting, but we've become so accustomed to it that we don't even notice how tiring it is. And then we add to this internal noise the external noise of social interaction, the need to monitor what others are thinking, to calibrate our responses, to manage impressions, to navigate the complex web of social expectations and unspoken rules. It's like running multiple complex programs on a computer simultaneously. The system works, but it's maxed out, constantly on the edge of overload. When the spiritually awake person enters solitude, many of these programs can shut down. There's no one to impress, no image to maintain, no performance required. And in that relaxation, something deeper can emerge. The constant mental chatter begins to settle, like sediment sinking to the bottom of a glass of water. And as it settles, the water becomes clear. The mind becomes still, spacious, transparent. And in that stillness, you can perceive reality more directly, without the constant filtering and interpretation of the egoic mind. This stillness isn't empty or dead. It's alive, vibrant, creative. It's the source from which all genuine insight, all real creativity, all authentic wisdom emerges. You can't access it when you're caught up in the frantic activity of social performance and mental noise. It's too subtle, too quiet. But in solitude, when the surface activity calms down, you can tune into it. And once you've tasted this, once you've experienced the profound peace and clarity that's available in deep solitude, you begin to crave it, not as an escape from life, but as a return to your source, a remembering of what you actually are beneath all the conditioning and conceptualization. This is why so many spiritual traditions emphasize periods of solitude, silence, and retreat. It's not because there's something virtuous about being alone, or because social interaction is spiritually inferior. It's simply that in our ordinary social consciousness, we're so identified with the surface movements of mind, with thoughts, emotions, reactions, and the constant construction of self-image, that we can't perceive the depths. Solitude provides the conditions for this deeper perception to occur. It's like trying to see the stars. You can't see them in broad daylight, not because they're not there, but because the sunlight is too bright. You need the darkness of night for the stars to become visible. Similarly, you need the quietness of solitude for the deeper dimensions of consciousness to reveal themselves. But here's what's crucial to understand. The goal isn't to become addicted to solitude, to use it as another form of escape, another way of avoiding the challenges of human existence. That would be just another trap, another way the ego can co-opt spiritual practice for its own purposes. The real freedom is to be equally at ease in solitude and in company, to move fluidly between inner and outer, to bring the clarity and spaciousness discovered in solitude into your interactions with others. When you can do this, something magical happens in your relationships. Because you're no longer using other people to fill your inner emptiness or validate your existence, you can actually see them, really see them, perhaps for the first time. You're not relating to your projection of them, your idea of who they should be, your hope for what they can give you. You're meeting them as they actually are, in this moment, without the filter of neediness and expectation. And this quality of presence, this capacity to meet another person without agenda, is extraordinarily rare and precious. Most human relationships, if we're honest, are transactions. I'll give you attention if you give me validation. I'll love you if you love me back. I'll be there for you if you meet my needs. It's not that anyone is consciously calculating these trades. It happens unconsciously, automatically, as a natural consequence of the separate self trying to get what it thinks it needs from others. And these transactional relationships work, up to a point. They can be pleasant, functional, even loving in a limited way, but they're always constrained by the agenda of the ego, always conditional, always carrying an undercurrent of fear, fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. When you stop relating from neediness, when you stop trying to get something from others to complete yourself, a different kind of relationship becomes possible. It's not that you become cold or distant, quite the opposite. You become capable of genuine intimacy, genuine love, because you're not using the other person. You're simply enjoying their presence, appreciating their unique expression of consciousness, delighting in the mystery of another awareness. There's nothing you need from them, and paradoxically, this makes the connection deeper, more authentic, more nourishing for both parties. This is why spiritually awake people can seem paradoxical in their social behavior. They might spend long periods in solitude, appearing almost monastic, and then engage in social interaction with surprising warmth and openness. They're not withdrawn in the sense of being defended or afraid. They're simply not compelled by the usual forces that drive social behavior. They don't need to network, to build their reputation, to collect friends like trophies, to prove their worth through social success. All of that falls away as irrelevant when you're no longer trying to construct and maintain a self-image. What remains is something far more simple and direct, an interest in the actual, lived experience of being human. An awakened person might love sitting with someone and exploring ideas, not to prove their intelligence, but because ideas are fascinating. They might enjoy helping others, not to be seen as a good person, but because compassion arises naturally when you're not caught up in your own psychological drama. They might appreciate beauty, humor, connection, all the richness of human experience, but without the desperate grasping that characterizes the unawakened state. There's a lightness to it, a playfulness. Because when you're not taking the whole performance so seriously, when you've seen through the cosmic joke of the separate self, life becomes less heavy, less burdensome. You can engage with it fully without being imprisoned by it. You can care deeply without being attached. You can love without clinging. This isn't indifference. It's a deeper form of engagement, one that's not contaminated by the ego's agenda. Consider what happens in a typical social interaction when you're identified with the ego. You're constantly monitoring yourself and others. What do they think of me? Did I say that right? Am I being interesting enough? Did they notice my accomplishment? Are they judging me? This internal commentary is running almost continuously, creating a layer of self-consciousness that prevents you from being fully present. You're not really in the conversation. You're in your head, thinking about the conversation, evaluating it, worrying about it. The exhaustion of social interaction for many people comes from this constant self-monitoring, this unrelenting pressure to perform a successful self. Introverts often find social interaction draining, not because they dislike people, but because the energy required to maintain this performance is immense. And even extroverts, who gain energy from social interaction, are often fueling themselves on the validation they receive, on the ego boost of being seen, appreciated, admired. It's a kind of addiction, and like all addictions, it requires ever-increasing doses to maintain the same effect. When you're no longer caught in this pattern, when you've seen through the separate self that needs constant validation, social interaction becomes effortless in a new way. You're simply present. You're listening without planning your response. You're speaking without censoring yourself through the filter of self-image. You're responding spontaneously rather than strategically. There's a naturalness, an authenticity, that people can sense even if they can't articulate what's different. And often, people find such interactions deeply refreshing, precisely because they're encountering someone who isn't trying to get something from them, who isn't performing a role, who's just present. But here's the paradox. While awakened people can be deeply present and engaged in social interaction, they're also perfectly content to be alone. They don't seek out company to escape themselves. They don't fill their calendars with social obligations out of fear of emptiness. They're comfortable with large stretches of solitude, not as ascetic discipline or as avoidance, but simply because solitude is where they naturally rest when the social currents aren't pulling them into interaction. This preference for solitude is often misunderstood by others. Friends and family might worry that something is wrong, that the person is depressed or antisocial. They might interpret the reduced interest in social activity as rejection or withdrawal. And in a culture that valorizes constant connectivity, constant busyness, constant social engagement, someone who opts out of this pattern can seem strange, even threatening, because their very existence challenges the unspoken assumption that human fulfillment comes through external achievement and social connection. The awakened person isn't trying to prove anything by their preference for solitude. They're not making a statement or positioning themselves as superior to others. They're simply following what feels natural and true for them. And what feels natural, increasingly, is spending time in direct contact with reality itself, rather than with the social constructions we layer over reality. In solitude, you can hear the wind, watch the clouds, feel the breath, sense the aliveness of the present moment, without the constant distraction of social stimulation. This isn't a regression to some primitive state or an escape into nature mysticism. It's about recovering a dimension of experience that gets lost in the constant noise of modern life. When you're always stimulated, always entertained, always connected digitally, always processing social information, You lose touch with the simple fact of existence itself. You forget what it's like to just be, without doing anything, without being anyone, without going anywhere. And in that forgetting, you lose access to the deepest source of peace, creativity, and wisdom available to human consciousness. Solitude, for the awakened person, becomes a form of meditation, not meditation as a formal practice that you do for 20 minutes a day, but as a way of being that pervades all of life. It's a settling into presence, a resting in awareness, a allowing of experience to be as it is, without the constant manipulation and commentary of the egoic mind. And this can happen just as easily while walking alone in a forest as while sitting in a room or looking out a window. The external circumstances matter less than the internal orientation. What's happening in these moments of solitary presence is a kind of recalibration. The nervous system, which has been conditioned to operate in a constant state of low-level stress and vigilance, begins to relax. The mind, which has been racing through endless cycles of thought, begins to slow down and settle. The sense of being a separate self, which has been constantly reinforced by social interaction and self-referential thought, begins to become transparent. And in this relaxation, this settling, this transparency, something else emerges. A vast, spacious awareness that has no center and no boundary, that contains all experience without being affected by it, that is simultaneously intensely present and utterly transcendent. This might sound abstract or mystical, but it's actually the most concrete, immediate experience available to consciousness. It's not some special state that requires years of practice to achieve. It's the simple awareness of being aware, the recognition of the consciousness that's animating this very moment. The only reason it seems distant or difficult is that we're so habitually identified with the content of consciousness, with thoughts, sensations, emotions, perceptions, that we overlook consciousness itself. It's like being so absorbed in watching a movie that you forget you're sitting in a theater. The movie is compelling, the story draws you in, and you lose yourself in the drama on screen. But you never actually leave the theater. The theater, the space within which the movie appears, is always there, always present, always unchanged by whatever dramas play out within it. Consciousness is like that theater, and all of our experience, all our thoughts, emotions, sensations, all the events of our lives are like the movie. The awakened person has remembered that they're the theater, not just the movie. Or more precisely, they're the awareness that's aware of both the theater and the movie, the container and the contained. Once you've recognized this, solitude takes on a completely different quality. You're no longer alone in the sense of being isolated. You're alone in the sense of being all one, unified with the totality of existence. The trees outside your window aren't separate from you. They're appearing within the same awareness that you are. The sounds of traffic, the sensation of breath, the thoughts moving through mind, all of it is arising within this single field of consciousness that has no inside or outside. You are that field, and everything is appearing within you, as you. This realization doesn't make you grandiose or inflate your ego. In fact, it has precisely the opposite effect, because if everything is appearing within this one consciousness, then there's no special me that's better or worse than anything else. The person you appear to be is just another appearance, another form that consciousness is taking, no more or less significant than any other form. This levels everything out, creates a profound humility and ordinariness. You're nothing special, and simultaneously, you're the entire cosmos. The personal self deflates, and the universal self is recognized as what you've always been. People who are moving into this recognition often go through a phase where social interaction becomes genuinely difficult. Not because they're avoiding people, but because they can see through the social game so clearly that participating in it feels false, almost impossible. They watch people compete for status, gossip about others, complain about their lives, pursue goals that they don't really care about, and it all seems so unnecessary, so dreamlike. They want to say, "Don't you see? None of this matters. We're all playing at being separate selves, but there's only one consciousness here, playing all the parts." But of course, you can't say that. Or rather, you can, but it will sound like nonsense to someone who hasn't seen it for themselves. This phase can be isolating, and it's one of the reasons why spiritual communities exist, to provide a context where these recognitions can be shared, where the truth you've seen can be acknowledged and validated by others who've seen it too. But even within spiritual communities, there can be a subtle new form of ego building, a subtle competition about who's more awakened, who has the deeper realization, who's more authentic in their expression. The ego is remarkably clever at co-opting spiritual insight for its own purposes, dressing itself up in spiritual garb while maintaining its fundamental structure. The truly awakened person eventually moves beyond this phase. They stop trying to communicate their insight, stop trying to convince others, stop being bothered by the fact that most people are still caught in the dream of separation. They simply live from their understanding, quietly, without fanfare, without needing to make a thing of it. And this is where solitude becomes not just comfortable, but positively delicious. Because in solitude, you don't have to navigate the complex territory of speaking from one paradigm to people operating in another. You don't have to translate the wordless recognition into clumsy words. You don't have to watch people misunderstand or dismiss something that's precious to you. In solitude, you can simply rest in the truth of what you've seen. You can let it deepen, let it permeate every cell of your being, let it transform your perception without having to explain or justify or defend it. And this deepening is crucial. Initial awakening experiences can be profound, but they need to be integrated, embodied, lived into. This integration often requires periods of withdrawal from social stimulation, times of quiet reflection and contemplation, where the new understanding can settle in and become your natural way of being, rather than just an interesting insight you once had. Think of it like learning a new language. At first, you have to translate everything mentally from your native language to the new one. It's effortful, clumsy, slow. But gradually, with practice, you begin to think in the new language directly, without translation. It becomes natural, automatic. The same process happens with spiritual awakening. At first, you're constantly moving between the old paradigm of separation and the new recognition of unity. You see through the ego, and then you're caught in it again. You rest as awareness, and then you're identified with thoughts. But gradually, with time and practice and periods of solitude for integration, the new way of being becomes your default mode. You still know how to operate in the conventional world, can still think and plan and function as a person, but you're no longer fooled by it. You know what you are underneath all the appearances. This is why spiritual teachers throughout history have emphasized practice, not as a means of achieving something you don't have, but as a way of stabilizing the recognition of what you already are. Meditation, contemplation, self-inquiry. These aren't techniques for becoming enlightened. They're methods for resting as the enlightenment that's already present, for training the attention to remain with awareness rather than being constantly lost in the content of awareness. And this training is much easier in solitude, where the demands of social interaction aren't pulling you into identification with the personal self. But there's a danger here that needs to be acknowledged. It's possible to use solitude as an escape, to withdraw from life out of fear or disappointment, to hide in spiritual concepts rather than facing the messy reality of human existence. This is spiritual bypassing, and it's surprisingly common. The person who's constantly at retreats but can't maintain a relationship, who talks about unity consciousness but treats others with unconscious cruelty, who's perfected their meditation practice but hasn't dealt with their psychological wounds. These are examples of using spirituality to avoid life rather than to engage with it more deeply. Genuine spiritual awakening doesn't make you less human. It makes you more fully human. It doesn't remove you from life. It allows you to participate in life more completely, without the constant interference of self-concern. And this means that while solitude is valuable and necessary, it can't be the only thing. At some point, you have to bring what you've discovered in solitude back into relationship, back into the marketplace, back into the messy, complicated, sometimes painful world of human interaction. The spiritually mature person moves fluidly between solitude and company, between inner and outer, between being and doing. They're not attached to either pole. They can enjoy deep periods of solitude without becoming isolated or antisocial. They can engage in social interaction without losing touch with the silent awareness that underlies all experience. They've integrated the insight rather than just having it as an experience they once had. And this integration is what allows them to prefer solitude without making it a rigid identity or a spiritual achievement. The preference for solitude, when it arises from genuine awakening rather than from woundedness or fear, has a particular quality to it. It's not heavy or serious. It's not accompanied by judgment of those who prefer company. It's simply a natural inclination, like preferring tea to coffee, arising from a recognition of where you're most nourished, most at peace, most aligned with your true nature. And because it's natural rather than forced, there's a flexibility to it. If circumstances call for social engagement, you can engage fully. If circumstances offer solitude, you can sink into it gratefully. There's no rigidity, no should or shouldn't, just a simple responsiveness to what is. This flexibility is itself a sign of spiritual maturity. Immature spirituality is often rigid, absolute, black and white. It makes rules. Meditation is good. Distraction is bad. Solitude is spiritual. Parties are worldly. Silence is deep. Talking is superficial. Mature spirituality recognizes that nothing is inherently spiritual or unspiritual. It all depends on how you relate to it. You can be deeply present washing dishes, and you can be completely lost in thought sitting on a meditation cushion. The external form matters less than the internal orientation. So when we say that spiritually awake people prefer solitude, we're not saying they withdraw from the world or reject human connection. We're saying something more subtle, that their center of gravity shifts from the social egoic dimension of existence to something deeper, more fundamental. They're no longer primarily oriented around building and maintaining a social self. They're oriented around consciousness itself, around the direct experience of being, around the mysterious fact of existence. And this orientation naturally inclines them towards solitude, because solitude is where this dimension of experience is most accessible, most vivid, most undisturbed by the surface movements of social life. But notice that even in saying this, we're making generalizations that might not apply to every awakened person. Some beings are naturally more contemplative, more drawn to silence and stillness. Others are naturally more expressive, more oriented toward activity and engagement. The Buddha sat under a tree. Christ walked among the people. Both were awakened, but their expressions were different. What they shared wasn't a particular lifestyle or set of behaviors, but a fundamental recognition. The recognition that they were not the person they appeared to be, that consciousness itself was their true nature, and that this consciousness was not personal, but universal. This recognition can express itself in countless ways, and none of them is more correct than the others. The hermit meditating in a cave and the teacher engaging with thousands of students might both be equally awakened. What matters isn't the external form, but the internal freedom, the absence of compulsive identification with the personal self, the capacity to rest as awareness regardless of circumstances, the loss of the desperate seeking that characterizes the unawakened state. And yet, despite all this variation, there does seem to be a general trend. Those who have awakened spiritually find themselves naturally drawn to more solitude than they were before. Not necessarily total solitude, not necessarily a rejection of all social contact, but a rebalancing, a shift in priorities. They find that they need less external stimulation, less social validation, less constant connection. They're comfortable with quiet, with stillness, with their own company in a way they weren't before. And this comfort isn't a discipline they're imposing on themselves. It's a natural consequence of having discovered that they're already complete, already whole, already at peace in their essential nature. The world of social interaction, when you see it from this perspective, reveals itself as a kind of mass hypnosis, a collective trance that we all agree to maintain. We pretend that the roles we play are real, that the stories we tell about ourselves are true, that the dramas we engage in actually matter in some ultimate sense. And they do matter, within the relative world, within the human dimension of existence. But they don't matter absolutely. They're not touching what you fundamentally are. You can play your part fully, can care deeply about the outcomes, can feel the full range of human emotions, but there's also a part of you that knows it's all a kind of dream, a kind of play, a kind of cosmic game that consciousness is playing with itself. Once you've seen this, you can't fully buy into the collective trance anymore. You can function within it, can appear to take it seriously, can engage with the rules and norms of society. But internally, you're free from it. You're like an actor who knows they're in a play. They can deliver their lines with conviction, can feel genuine emotions as the character, but they never forget that they're acting. And when the play is over, they can step out of the role without confusion about who they are. This is the position of the awakened person in relation to social life. They can participate, can play their role, can even enjoy the drama and complexity of human interaction. But they're not lost in it. They're not identified with the character they're playing. And this lack of identification is what allows them to prefer solitude. Because in solitude, they can take off the costume, can stop playing the part, can rest as what they actually are, rather than as what they're pretending to be for the sake of social convention. Now, you might ask, if awakened people see through the social game, why participate in it at all? Why not just withdraw completely, become hermits, abandon all social pretense? And the answer is that the social game, while not ultimately real, is relatively real. It's the level on which human life unfolds. Completely withdrawing from it would be like an actor refusing to perform because they've realized the play isn't real. Well, of course it's not real. It's a play. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth doing, that it doesn't have value within its own context, that it can't be a vehicle for beauty, truth, creativity, connection. The awakened person understands that there are different levels of reality, different dimensions of truth. On the absolute level, there's only consciousness, only awareness, only the one appearing as the many. But on the relative level, there are distinct individuals, there are relationships, there are consequences to actions, there is meaning and purpose within the human story. Both levels are true, and mature spirituality can hold both simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. This is what allows the awakened person to engage with life fully without being trapped in it, to care deeply without being attached, to participate in the human drama without losing themselves in it. They can be alone without loneliness because they know themselves as consciousness, which is never actually separate from anything. And they can be with others without neediness because they're not using others to complete themselves or validate their existence. The journey to this recognition often begins with a crisis of some kind, a loss, a failure, a dark night of the soul where all the usual coping mechanisms break down. In that crisis, the person is forced to let go, to stop trying to control and manipulate experience, to surrender to what is. And in that surrender, something unexpected happens. The self they thought they were, the one who needed to be protected, validated, improved, reveals itself as a construction, a story, and a voice that was never actually real in the way they believed. The voice that's been commenting on their life, judging their experiences, planning their future. That voice isn't who they are. It's simply a pattern of thought, a habit of mind, one more appearance within consciousness. When this is seen clearly, everything shifts. It's not that the person becomes enlightened in some final, permanent way, though that can happen. More commonly, there's an opening, a glimpse, a moment of seeing through the veil. And while they might return to ordinary consciousness, something has changed. They've tasted freedom, and they can't completely forget it. The old motivations begin to lose their grip. The desperate pursuit of success, approval, security, all of it begins to seem hollow, pointless. Not because they've become pessimistic or depressed, but because they've touched something more real, more satisfying, more fundamentally fulfilling than anything the world of seeking can offer. This is when the preference for solitude often begins to emerge, because in solitude, away from the demands and expectations of others, they can reconnect with that taste of freedom, can return to that recognition, can practice resting as awareness rather than as the stream of thoughts and emotions. Gradually, this practice deepens the recognition, makes it more stable, more accessible, more integrated into daily life. And as it deepens, the need for constant social stimulation naturally diminishes, not through force or discipline, but through simple disinterest. It's like losing your taste for junk food once you've discovered the richness of real, whole food. You don't have to force yourself to avoid it. You simply don't want it anymore. The person who is becoming spiritually awake begins to notice how much energy they were pouring into social performance, into maintaining their image, into positioning themselves favorably in others' eyes. And they begin to realize that this energy could be used for something else, for creative work, for deepening their understanding, for simply being present with what is. The choice becomes obvious: continue investing in a fiction or turn toward what's real. And increasingly, they choose the real. This doesn't make them isolated or disconnected. Paradoxically, as they become more comfortable with solitude, they often become more genuinely connected in their relationships, because they're no longer using people, no longer approaching relationships transactionally, no longer imprisoned by the fear of what others think. They can be honest, direct, present in a way that wasn't possible when they were caught in social performance. And people often find this quality of presence magnetic, even if they can't articulate what's different about it. There's something deeply nourishing about being with someone who isn't trying to get anything from you, who can simply meet you where you are without agenda or manipulation. But the person themselves isn't trying to be magnetic or attractive. They're not cultivating presence as a social skill or a spiritual accomplishment. They're simply living from what they've discovered to be true, responding naturally to life without the constant interference of self-concern. And this natural responsiveness sometimes leads to deep engagement with others, sometimes to periods of solitary contemplation. There's no fixed pattern, no should or shouldn't, just a fluid movement in response to circumstances and inner inclination. What becomes clear, over time, is that solitude and company aren't really opposites. They're both experiences arising within consciousness, both appearances in the same awareness. The awareness itself is never alone and never in company. It simply is, unchanging and ever-present, whether there are other people in the room or not. When you know yourself as this awareness, the question of solitude versus company loses its charge. Both are fine. Both have their place. Neither is better or worse, more spiritual or less spiritual. This might seem like a disappointing conclusion, a kind of "it's all the same" that negates the whole inquiry. But it's actually incredibly liberating. Because when neither solitude nor company is invested with special significance, when neither is being used to fulfill the ego or escape the ego, you're free to respond naturally to what life presents. If you're invited to a gathering and it feels right to go, you go. If you're invited and it feels right to decline, you decline. There's no inner conflict, no guilt, no feeling that you should be different than you are. This natural simplicity is the hallmark of spiritual maturity. The beginner makes everything complicated. They're constantly analyzing, evaluating, trying to figure out the right way to be spiritual. The advanced practitioner makes everything simple again. They just live, just respond, just are, without all the mental overlay. And this simplicity includes a natural preference for solitude, when solitude is what's needed for deepening, for integration, for resting in the truth of what they are. But let's be honest about something. This path isn't for everyone, and it doesn't have to be. Most people are meant to live fully engaged with the social world, building families, creating businesses, participating in the full drama of human existence. That's not less spiritual than the contemplative path. It's just different. What matters is whether you're awake within whatever life you're living, whether you're identified with the role or resting as the awareness that witnesses the role. You can be deeply awakened while raising children and working a conventional job, and you can be completely lost while sitting in a cave meditating. The external circumstances don't determine spiritual realization. The internal recognition does. The preference for solitude among awakened people, then, isn't a prescription or a path that others should follow. It's simply a description of what often happens when consciousness begins to recognize itself. The energy that was bound up in social seeking becomes available for other things. The compulsion to constantly engage with others diminishes. The capacity to rest in simple being strengthens. And naturally, organically, without forcing or shoulding, the person finds themselves drawn to more solitude, more silence, more stillness. This is the secret that spiritually awake people know. Solitude isn't lonely. It's where you discover that you were never alone to begin with. The separation between self and other, between inner and outer, between consciousness and its contents, all of that dissolves in the direct recognition of what you are. And in that recognition, whether you're physically alone or in a crowd of thousands, becomes secondary. The essential aloneness, the all-oneness, is always present, always accessible, always what you fundamentally are. So when you see someone who seems comfortable in their own company, who doesn't seem to need the constant stimulation and validation that drives most people, who can sit contentedly with nothing to do and no one to be, know that you're witnessing something rare and precious. Not because they're better than others or more evolved, but because they've discovered something that's available to everyone but recognized by few. The peace that's already present beneath all the seeking, the completeness that doesn't depend on circumstances, the freedom that was never actually lost. They prefer solitude, not because they're running from life, but because they've found, in the depths of their own being, something more fulfilling than anything the social world can offer. And having found it, they naturally want to return to it, to rest in it, to let it permeate every aspect of their existence. This is the secret heart of the spiritual life, not achievement or improvement, but recognition and return. Recognition of what you've always been, and return to the simplicity, the silence, the solitude, where that recognition can deepen into permanent realization.